event. So a really, really warm welcome to this Unjudged event. It's the first one that Liz and I have run, so thank you for being our guinea pigs as well. And we're really delighted that you're going to join us today to listen to a story of gender transition from Cynthia Fortlage's from her life. So I'm Alison Maitland, and together with Liz, who's been chatting away already, we're co-founders of Becoming, and we're on a mission to help women to lead unapologetic lives. And one of our fundamental beliefs at Becoming is that despite many of the messages to the contrary, women are not broken, but we do believe that we get stuck or knocked off track by some of the things that happen in the journeys of our careers and our lives. And so these Unjudged events are really an opportunity to hear a story from the life of a woman, Cynthia today, and to listen to their experience of something that's happened to them on their journey and how it's affected them. And I want you to think that actually, by listening to women's stories, what we're doing is trying to build that connection and understanding. And maybe think of it like a book. You know, when you're deep in the pages of a story, you're transported just momentarily to a person, a setting, and their experience. Now, we're not Cynthia, we haven't lived her life, but allowing ourselves to step into her story just for a time gives us the opportunity to broaden our experience and to challenge the stereotypes and prejudices that we might bring, but also to build compassion for the breadth of the human experience.
Let me add to that. So thank you, Alison. It is really lovely to be here with you all. We're about to hand over to Cynthia, but before we do, what I'd like to do is kind of just set some expectations about how we think this event will work. So at Becoming, and those of you who've worked with us will know this, we firmly believe in the concept of a safe space. And we define that as a place where you just get to be you and where you are seen and heard and valued for being you, and where we will always assume the best of each other. And so first and foremost, we want this to be a safe space for Cynthia, who is being generous with her story. So we want it to be a space where she can tell her story without judgment. And so we'd like to invite you to be accepting of that story, to gift Cynthia the space to be herself. We'd like to invite you to listen really deeply and see and hear and value Cynthia for who she is, and to be curious and to ask those questions respectfully that you want to ask. And then at the same time, it's a safe space for you. We'd like it to be a safe space for you where you can listen and ask those questions without judgment. And so please be comfortable here. This is not your regular Zoom meeting. This is not, there's no corporate face here. This is a gift to you. Okay, so relax and give yourself this opportunity to just enjoy and, like Alison says, settle in with the story. And then also please assume the best of each other. So even if we don't always know the right words, and even if the question feels a bit awkward and we're not sure if we're allowed to ask it, let's all focus on that curiosity and that desire to engage and build our understanding, and then the courage that it takes to do that. Logistically, I think we've put 45 minutes in your diary. What we said to Cynthia is that we've invited her to tell her story for maybe about 15, maybe 20 minutes, probably without interruption, although if you want to put stuff in the chat for later just to get it out of your head, that would be fine. And then once she's told her story, we'll open it up and we'll take questions, either, as I said, through the chat or in person. If you want to just start a conversation, that will be fine. And how long this goes very much depends on you. So if you have a deadline and you need to step away, then please do. If you want to stay and you're really engaged and interested, then please do. And we'll just manage the time as we go. So without further ado, take a deep breath, get comfy, get your cup of tea. And Cynthia, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you, Liz, and welcome everyone. Let me begin just by thanking Alison and Liz for creating this opportunity. I very much love to share the experiences that I've had. I like to really say that one of the things I've realized is that my superpower is the fact that as a leader, I was a C-suite corporate executive And through that process, I've seen the world through both sets of gendered eyes. And that really gives me a very unique perspective as an award-winning coach, working with women and the 2S LGBTQIA+ community, and working with organizations from a gender identity perspective, whether it be within teams, etc. I'm also very fortunate as a speaker, approaching about 300 events that I have been fortunate enough to be invited to speak at in 25 countries, which is half the countries I've actually traveled to. So that's very, very exciting as well. And I'm happy to be here with you today. What I wanted to do was to kind of build off this idea of creating a safe space. And I wanted to share with you my raison d'etre. My purpose in life is to talk about this concept of acceptance without understanding, as it says back here. And like every purpose that we find in our life, this one comes from a very deep personal space. And that's the first story that I'd like to share with you, because it really sets the tone to everything that I do. And I talk about living a life of acceptance. And I'm human. I try and live a life of acceptance. I'm certainly not perfect. And it's an effort every single day to learn and to help others understand that process. So the whole idea of acceptance is very simple. It is the world today, especially from the corporate world, but even before that through school, and even as, a toddler, preschool, we were taught this idea of asking why as a way to gather all of this understanding of the world around us, which means today, when we talk about people from diverse backgrounds, we really have been trained to understand someone in order to accept them. But if we don't understand them, we really have trouble accepting them. And it wasn't until I put the shoe on the other foot, albeit a really cute shoe, but I put the shoe on the other foot, and did I realize the world was so different than the world that I grew up, pretending to be a role that someone told me I was based upon my genitalia, not my identity. And that journey led me through a process that said, oh my gosh, the world is so different. And really, all I want you to simply do is accept that I'm a human being. That's it. I'm not asking you to accept whatever you perceive as my lifestyle or any other aspect. Just, can you accept that I'm a human being? And that's really special, because if you end up accepting this idea of being a human being, then that means you accept that I need to have my human rights. And because we know that human rights are about equity, not equality, therefore we all enjoy the human rights that we need. And this really came to life for me through my coming out process. I was married for 32 years. I have 2 adult children, a son who's 28 and a daughter who's 24. They're back in Canada. Even though I was born in Belfast and grew up there for the first few years of my life, the troubles in the early 70s caused my family to move. And I ended up growing up in Canada. I'm back here reestablishing myself and setting up my business here in the UK. And I've been very fortunate to connect with Alison and Liz through that process. So I'm very blessed. But in my process of dealing with my coming out process was with my spouse. And when I first told her of what was kind of going on, the response was, this was after about 28 years of marriage, you're sick, there's something wrong with you, you need to see somebody. Now, I was a C-suite executive at this point. So that's not something you kind of hearken out on Facebook and go, hey, does anybody know a really good therapist to help me with this? So I went through a very confidential process and found a therapist who I began working with. That was in January of 2016. And by February of 2016, in fact, it was 6 weeks later, February the 13th, I moved out of the marital home. Because at that point, there was too many barriers that were built where it wasn't about whether or not we loved each other, but the reality was that my spouse could not accept me. And so this idea of understanding unconditional love was about having the idea of love, but also acceptance. So unconditional love is love and acceptance of the person, which is really a non-judgmental way. And we talk about that with our kids but yet so many children who come out or identify differently, and let's clarify that, identify differently than their parents perceived their life was going to be, that it is the loss that the parents experience, not what the child is going through, that ends up causing that disconnect in the idea of unconditional love. And so this idea of, we just need to have acceptance in our life. We have love, but if we have love and acceptance, then we can have unconditional love to go forward with. And so while I had love through that relationship, unfortunately, I didn't have acceptance. And that's what led me on the process of beginning my journey and venturing through the very unique process that I have gone through. And I do that with acceptance without understanding. That's simply what it is. I wanted to share with you because, you know, I love the mission of what becoming is about. And this whole connection that women are not broke, absolutely right. But what I wanted to do was I picked a couple of stories from my life. I very tongue-in-cheek run a session every once in a while. It's called 50 Years of Male Thinking in 1 hour. And I run it for women. And so the whole intent is to really kind of draw in those experiences of where are men and women different? Where have I experienced the world so vastly different? And honestly, it wasn't the fact that on my first week on the job as me, that I had one of my male counterparts come up to me by the photocopy area, give me the nudge on the shoulder and go, you know, there is no such thing as male privilege. We won't get into that. But suffice it to say, he obviously didn't realize what privilege he was enjoying in that moment of being able to say that. But for me, the recognition of my first loss of male privilege was simply learning to walk down the street safely. This was not something I ever thought about. I had to learn the ability to walk down the street and to look ahead of me to see who's coming towards me, who's coming behind me. Do I feel safe? Is somebody else on the other side of the street? Do I have a way to exit? If I'm wearing heels, do I drop them and run? Do I try and run? Do I use them as a weapon? These are not questions that if you ask any man, they will ever understand, because they have no grasp that even in the middle of daylight, walking down the high street is an issue of safety for women. And that was one of my very first experiences of realizing the world of becoming me that I was entering into. The other story that I want to share with you is the aspect of what happens in the corporate world. For those that are in the corporate world, I'm sure this story will resonate with you. So it was a little within the first couple of weeks of being me on the job, and we went into a board meeting. Now, the board meetings that we had, it was a wonderfully small group. It was actually perfectly balanced, 50-50 male, female. I was the only queer identifying person within that group. There was no one of color that was represented within that, but at least we had the gender balance right. There was just a lot of other balances that weren't right. And when we deal with problems around the boardroom, we always do kind of an idea scrum. So we talk about and define the problem and really set the tone. And then we go through some idea scrum, building off each other, really creatively coming up. And because I was the head of IT, I was generally very involved in solving a lot of problems. And so in this first meeting, we went through the financials, reviewed everything, and we got to working on the first problem. And it became my turn, and I put my idea on the table. And there was complete silence, nothing. Not an acknowledgement for the idea, no dispute of the idea, no discussion of the idea. This was not something I was used to. And then my male counterpart, who's a friend, restated my idea and put it on the table. And everybody went crazy. Everybody was talking about it. They were building off it and going on and on. Now, just so you know, for a point of clarity, this counterpart and I, even previously, we always had the ability to implicitly understand each other. And when either of us was not clearly communicating, we would restate each other's ideas in order to kind of bring them forward, to make sure that they were heard. And so I took it in that moment that is what he was doing. But I was faced with a very difficult decision. As this was going on, do I step in and go, excuse me, that was my idea? And then I become known as that capital B word of, you know, what a petty little woman that she needs to have credit for every idea that she brings to the table? Or do I just shut up? Because it was obviously a technology-based idea and they seemed to like it. They were actively working on it. And at the end of the day, I would be responsible to implement it. So do I really just want to take the high road in that case, let the idea get accepted, and I'm ultimately going to be responsible to deliver it? And that's what I was doing, was just trying to help in the first place. Well, I took the latter. I ended up being quiet, letting the idea flow. And sure enough, it was what we agreed to do. And sure enough, it became my responsibility to develop the project and to roll it out. But it was the realization in that moment that as a woman at around the boardroom, from where I was before, I had lost my voice. I had lost the ability to be heard simply because of my gender. And when I went and talked to him after, you know, he just simply stated that, you know, he was just restating, doing what we had always done. He was not treating me any different. And, you know, we were just building on it. And I said, and that's wonderful. And it was in that conversation, I realized, oh my gosh, as a woman around the boardroom, I need an ally. I need a male ally who could say, excuse me, I think Cynthia put an idea on the table that we should talk about. Or perhaps if he didn't feel comfortable that, he could say, building on Cynthia's idea, and then he could restate it and build upon what he wanted. And we talked about that in terms of him becoming my ally around the table in order to actually have my voice heard. And I can't tell you, but I know that you understand how frustrating it was to have a seat at the table, but to actually not be included in the discussion, to not be heard. And that was, you know, really some of the early experiences that I had through this very difficult journey of really trying to grasp all of the diversity that I had to face of not only being transgender, but a woman with a history of being transgender, as how I define it today, that really set me up for having to really see the world through a different set of eyes. Now, I just want to do a bit of a time check because I definitely want to get into any Q&A that we're going to do. I do have one story in my pocket if we have time for it, but Liz, Allison, how are we doing? Do we want to move to Q&A or do we want to tell one more story?
I can only answer from a personal perspective. I'd like to hear another story.
Okay.
Yeah, got a couple of thumbs up. Go for it.
Okay. So the last story I want to share with you is why words matter. Now, when you walk into a restaurant, to a pub, venue, you know, or even go to a meeting and everybody goes, hi guys, how are you today? Or hi guys, welcome. What do you think? I can tell you that certainly, you know, it's a very colloquial saying. And certainly if you're a man, you may at some level hear that, go, oh yes, that's my identity. I agree with that. And away you go. And certainly I know when I'm out with my girlfriends and we're going out, we end up getting the greeting. We certainly do not want a performative answer of hi ladies. But I always go, well, why don't they use a better greeting? Why not hi everyone or hi folks? But what I want to share with you is what I hear in that moment, and it's why words matter. Because when I hear hi guys, I have to ask in that moment, did I just get outed? And if you're not familiar with the phrase, getting outed is the process of being identified as my former identity, not my current identity. And in doing so, that calls into question my safety. And that's both my physical safety, my psychological safety, and my emotional safety in that moment. And I actually have to scan the environment to see whether or not my physical safety is at risk because of someone who may actually object to my existence in that space. And you might think, well, Cynthia, that sounds a little extreme, but in 2019, there was 33 women who were murdered in the United States and Australia because the gentleman they were with killed them. And when in front of the judge said, "Judge, I was with her. I didn't realize. I was surprised. I panicked. I killed her. I'm sorry." And they were let off scot-free, known as the transgender panic defense. And while almost all of those women were Black and of Latino backgrounds, the simple fact is that as a transgender woman, it is part of the risk of just simply stepping out my door in personal safety every single day. And every time somebody uses a word as simple as "hi guys," that makes me wonder, am I going to die? And that's just the harsh reality of society and the way that people think, because they're focused on understanding, and they don't, because they haven't walked a mile in my shoes, as the saying goes. And so it is really with that to realize that that is but one simple phrase, and that we haven't talked about the dehumanizing effects of othering or misgendering that also play into that conversation. But I just hope that next time you hear the phrase "hi guys," maybe you can think of alternate terms like "hi folks," "hi everyone." If you're at work, it could be "hi team." Something that is much more inclusive for everyone and every identity that you may not know that's at the table. So I will absolutely pause there. And I think it's a good time to maybe get into some Q&A.
So I want to step in and put my hands up and say I used that very phrase on you about 20 minutes ago, 30 minutes ago, Cynthia, as we were getting set up.
Yeah.
And you called me on it, and I apologize at the time, and I apologize again. But it's amazing to me how even when we are aware and we are trying to be as inclusive as we can be, how easy it is to slip up.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And you know what? And that's simply all that you ever need to do, right? Is to simply acknowledge it and commit to doing better. And all we can do is live our life like a clock, and we need to learn to move forward.
So I'm happy to open the floor to questions. You can come off mute and ask a question, or you can pop it in the chat if you're not comfortable being recorded. Cynthia, may I ask you a question?
Yes.
What I've heard in some of your stories is stories of loss, a loss of safety, a loss of voice. I wondered if there's something that you feel you've gained.
I've gained the comfort of being in my own skin for 50 some years. I never aligned, and it wasn't until I was about 52 when I had I had 9 surgeries in 7 months. And one of those surgeries near the end of the process was what's called my gender affirming surgery. It used to be known as the sex change, but we call it gender confirmation surgery is probably my favorite phrase because it really is confirming the identity that's always existed. And I remember the very first moment after all the bandages were taken off and I was able to stand naked in front of a mirror in the hospital recovery area. And I looked at myself. I already had breast augmentation. And I looked in the mirror and I said, I finally feel complete. At 52 years old, I gained the comfort of actually feeling like I was in my own skin for the very first time. That was probably the most amazing thing. But I also think that I have gained a greater understanding of people because I address everyone with acceptance first and foremost. I attempt to be as non-judgmental. I've rebuilt the relationship with my kids by allowing them to be just simply themselves and have no expectations. I set no expectations of what it takes to make me proud as a parent. Just simply being themselves, authentically each and every day is it. And that's one of the challenges we run into as human beings, is that we always are trying to be something else for someone else. And we're never really truly authentic. And you don't have to be queer or gay or transgender or anything else to be authentic. And learning to be authentic is such a beautiful thing. So I hope that helps answer that question a bit, Liz.
No, I know I have a question, but I can ask you anytime, Cynthia. So I'm curious if someone from the audience wants to ask something.
Yeah.
I'll ask something. Sorry, I'll put my video on. Really loved the story you told, Cynthia, about being in the boardroom, and I've experienced that so many times, you know, in terms of just not being heard. And I wondered what advice or what tips you would give, you know, in those sorts of situations to women, you know, having experienced both sides, you know, as the best way to be heard and to be taken seriously in those sorts of situations.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, wonderful question. You know, one of the first things we have to realize, of course, is that women face something, well, they face many things that men don't, but one of the things that we face within the corporate world is the double bind, the impact of the double bind. And very simply, if you're not familiar with it, the double bind says that if we go to our nurturing side, that we're too soft, we're not management material. If we go to the other side, well, usually we end up with a capital B title to our identity because we're too strong. And if you are very comfortable being the strong, and I've met female leaders who are, and they absolutely have every right to kind of make that demand of that respect. But for me, what I found was that I really needed to find an ally, a male ally in that space who can ensure that I am heard, and help uplift. Again, you know, it could just be as simple as saying, you know, I think Cynthia put an idea on the table. Perhaps we should explore it, or building on that idea that Cynthia shared to do it. It just took something as simple as that for him to be an ally in that space in order to be heard. And so really, you've kind of really got strategically those two kinds of options as to, if you already are that strong in your identity, you really don't care what labels they may be giving you, then absolutely go ahead and ask it. I played the other side, which was I was looking for the support to kind of help uplift the ideas and to make them heard. I hope that helps a little.
Hazel, you've got your hand up. You want to pop off mute and ask your question?
Yeah, I do. Do you know what, Cynthia? When you said you took your bandages off and you saw the you that you were always hoping to be. I'm sorry, my language might be terrible, but
that's okay.
You know, I just had an overwhelming sense of empathy then. I had a few tears at that moment in time. What a lovely, lovely thing for you to say. But I'm interested. I work with a lot of younger people, and younger people seem to be more accepting than perhaps sort of, you know, I'm 50 something as well. So if we go back into my childhood and growing up and stuff, you know, it really was a struggle to be accepted. And I'm wondering whether or not you still find that level of, you know, you have to bolster yourself and that personal resilience, you know, on a daily basis, or whether or not you're more relaxed now, you're you, and there is better acceptance more generally.
Interesting question. I think it's, you're right about the youth. The youth for me they're hope. And it's just the hope that the world can be a different place, because they are very different than any generation that I've seen before. And they're absolutely inspiring me every single day. In terms of myself, yeah, I have moments. I don't think that I'm any different than any other woman that way. So forth. I have imposter syndrome some moments, and I have to talk myself through it. I have anxiety, which, just so you know, I never had anxiety before until I started estrogen therapy. So I believe that estrogen is directly tied to the anxiety that we feel and experience to the degree that we do as women. And, you know, I have techniques and processes that I take myself through. And, you know, some days I have really bad days and I just don't want to get up out of bed and face the world. And other days I'm gung-ho and I'm ready to put on my suit of armor and go to battle. So I think in that way, I'm just human. And it's just simply, I now do it in a way that I'm very comfortable just being me.
And I think thank you. And I think you're right about, I think we all suffer from that imposter syndrome sometimes. You just have to look in the mirror, straighten your crown and kind of like get on with it, really. Can I ask one more follow-up question? Will that be all right?
Yes.
So I have a real bee in my bonnet about gender neutral toilets.
Okay.
And I've only ever worked somewhere once where that's, you know, that was introduced. And how can I get, you know, places where I work to take that seriously as I think it should be, and actually move towards that opportunity for everybody?
Well, I mean, great question. My experience was there was no gender neutral toilets, and we had to go through the whole discussion. And there was a conversation by the head of HR in the firm that I was with. We were about 150 people, 80 in the office that I was in when I came out. And every woman was talked to one-on-one by the head of HR and talked about what was going on, what was going to happen. I had committed that, you know, with quote, appropriate planning, not feeling any sense of urgency, I would go to another floor in the building and use the washroom there. It was a multi-tenant building. So, you know, those tenants didn't get a voice, and I really didn't care what they think because I was just being me and I needed to go to the loo. It wasn't like I needed it for anything else. So, but ultimately it just got to the point where I was very much accepted as who I was. And I just used the loo just like everyone else. So I think when it comes to the idea within organizations, sometimes, you know, there are, you know, issues, could be financial, where they don't have the resources to quote redevelop the bathrooms, etc. And so, you know, what are the alternates to that? You know, in schools we see that, you know, at times they do end up having the I think it's the staff washrooms that are used, you know, where students who may be transitioning, identifying, are allowed to go use those washrooms, given special permission. So I think it's just a matter in every situation, having to kind of work out what works and doesn't. Obviously, if there's an office redevelopment going on, well, you know, redo the bathrooms and just make them gender neutral, just put in full length stalls, problem solved, have a nice day, and away we go. So I hope that helps a little bit, but I honestly believe that every situation is different of how you challenge it. I think it's a different challenge if you get outright no's, because those are people who are not willing to accept. And I fully go forward every single day knowing there are people who will never accept, or they're not ready to accept. And I think we all know that we cannot change someone's mind, right? We can only change ourselves. And so therefore I accept, but I also accept that, you know, which hills I'm about to die on, politically or otherwise. So I hope that helps.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. I see we have a few hands up. I believe Daya had to hand up first.
Hello. Hi, Cynthia.
Hi.
I was just, you seem so at peace with yourself and so happy and, you know, accepting everyone, which is absolutely wonderful. My question was, rewind to when you were coming out, when you were having these questions with your family and discussions, and probably didn't get the acceptance that you may have now or expected then. Was there anger, and how did you deal with that?
Thank you. So I think the anger resulted in tears. I just cried it out. So just to give you perspective, I was disowned by my birth family, both my two birth sisters, older and younger, and both my parents. I ended up reconciling with them kind of within days, within 24 to 48 hours of them actually passing away. we had a reconciliation, and I believe they both knew that it was there. And so this idea of loss in my life, not only did I lose my birth family, both my parents passed away by year 2 of my transition process. And I only have those last moments with each of them. But I also lost my 32-year marriage because of this process. And for the first year, my children would not talk to me. I think we spoke 3 times for no more than 2 hours total in the first year that I was so it was a very lonely process. And that resulted in a lot of tears. It also resulted in me finding meditation, and a lot of my spiritual journey began as I began to find ways to navigate through that. So that's when I talk about the idea of acceptance, and in my coaching with women, I talk about the 4 aspects: our physical self, our cognitive self, our emotional self, and our spiritual self. And I believe that we need to look at all 4 aspects of dealing with it, even, you know, in a team setting and so forth. There's how do we kind of work through all these processes when we talk about, you know, making change within ourselves or within an organization, because I'm also a corporate cultural expert. I help people create intentional cultures within their organizations as a part of the training that I've had. So I hope that helps give you a sense of kind of how I got to that, Daya. Thank you. And I see that Vanessa's been waiting patiently. Thank you.
Thank you. I had a question for you about the acceptance piece, and particularly when you were talking about the loos, the toilets, and some people will just outright say no because they don't accept. And I like what you said earlier about acceptance without understanding, like, let's just accept. How do we help or encourage people to have that view, to accept, even if they don't understand? Have you got any, I mean, through your experience, you must have had to deal with that.
Oh, absolutely. So, I mean, the first thing to realize is that in this idea of acceptance, right, is also this whole idea for the very first thing that I ever learned in management in my kind of early days. And the fact was, I can't change anyone else. I can't make them be the employee that I want them to be. The only thing I can do is change myself. And in doing so, learn to manage them differently, you know, to help encourage behaviors, etc. And really, it's no different here. So I can I can educate them what acceptance is and so forth, and see if they wish to step up and, you know, take that journey. But the reality is that not everyone will want to. And I accept that there are people who will not accept me, if you will, the haters of the world. There are people who will never accept me, and I accept that. But I do not have to accept them in my life. And so therefore, I make decisions at that point as to what I need to do to have these people in or out of my life. And, you know, in the corporate environment, it's a little different because now we're dealing with kind of structure and, you know, roles, responsibilities. And for instance, if someone's part of a management team and senior management said, this is now the operating model, the culture of the organization is about acceptance. Well, then they kind of either have to get in line, in which case the manager who's managing them needs to manage them up or manage them out if they fail to realign themselves to the organizational culture, right? And so that becomes, you know, part of the tactic. But individually, on a day-to-day basis, they're just people who won't. And it's not my job to change the world. My job is simply to spread the message and to make them aware that there's a different way to think. It's up to them to decide whether they want to change. I hope that helps.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Catherine.
Hi, so thank you very much for sharing your story. So I'm not really part of the corporate world. I'm actually a medical student at the moment. So my questions probably going to be a bit different to maybe what others might ask.
Okay.
But just through the whole kind of process of your transition, I'm just wondering if there were things that medical professionals did that made you feel more comfortable and more accepted, and maybe other things that I can then do and take into my practice if I'm ever sort of faced with helping a patient like yourself.
I want to hug you right now. Thank you. Yes, absolutely. Because what they did is they recognized me for who I am, not who I was. And really, it's just that simple. Is recognize me, acknowledge. If you don't know my pronouns, ask what my pronouns are. so that you can address me accordingly. And if it's early in the process and I haven't legally changed everything, can you adapt and to use my given name that I've given myself? And that all my paperwork may not align, but does the processes that you're working with allow you to deal with it? And I'll share with you one tidbit. I was working with a facility here in the UK, part of the NHS. They were developing a new patient intake form. It was for a surgical unit. And they came to me and said, Cynthia, what do we do like with all this language of, she, he, the whole bit, all the advisory. And we went through this whole process and we kind of started to do some rewording. And I said, so when someone walks in here, what do you call them? And they go, well, a patient. And I go, okay, so if it's a woman, they're a patient, yes. And if it's a man, they're a patient, yes. And I said, and if they're non-gender conforming, are they still a patient? Yep. Okay. I said, so why don't you just call everybody a patient? And on the form, I said, just forget all the language about, she, he, the whole bit. Just say the patient. The patient consents to this, and just change the language to make it simple. So if you're in business and it's called the client or, whoever it is that you're working with and whatever phrase you use, then just have the form reflect that the client is this. And then you don't need to worry about all that difficulty in, the gendered space. So anyways, I hope that helps. And thank you for asking that.
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Yeah.
Can I just press a slight pause here? I recognise, as Liz said, that we did say, you've kindly, hopefully gifted yourself the opportunity to have this conversation with Cynthia, and we put 45 minutes in your diaries. So I'm just recognising some of you may need to step off, and I think both Liz, Cynthia and I would recognise that, and Cynthia has kindly gifted us the opportunity to continue to, understand the breadth of her experience and have some questions. So if you can stay on, please do stay on. I know Kanika and Mikhail, you've got your hands up. So if you do need to pop off, that's absolutely fine. And thank you so much for just holding that book open just for a little while and stepping into Cynthia's story. And if you can stay, fantastic, because I know Cynthia said she's absolutely fine to stay on and answer all the questions we have. So Cynthia, back to you.
Fabulous, thank you. So we'll go over to, is it Kanika? Did I say that correctly?
Yep, you did perfect, actually. Thank you for that too. I don't believe I have a question per se. I didn't want to leave without saying this before I left, because there were a lot of aha moments in your stories. Language was one of the big ones for me, and what you have given me today, apart from a lot of other stuff, is a word that I will be using a lot. So I struggle a lot with the word normal, and in explaining the opposite of normal, because it gets my goat, the word normal, and the word you used today, authentic, that blew my mind. And I'm like, it's such a simple word, but that totally changes the way I would like to express it, and I would like to hear other people express it as well.
Yeah.
So thank you for that. Thank
You're
you for all
welcome.
your stories. And I really don't have a question. I do also want to say, Catherine, what a question. I was blown over by that question. So thank you for asking that question as well. And that's all.
Oh, you're so welcome. Thank you. Thank you. Mikhail.
Thank you. I joined a bit late, so I apologize if you touched on this. And first, thank you for your presentation. As Kanika just said, particularly the language point, I myself who used to say, hey guys, but I wanted to move away from it. But when you talked about the perspective of how what it means for you as in terms of, oh, is someone outing me out? That's something that I've never considered. So with all the reasons before that I had not to be using that's just very clearly not using it anymore.
Yeah.
But the question that I had is, I have perhaps from a personal perspective, I have a friend who has just recently started transitioning. They came out to us about a year ago, and I wanted to ask you. Obviously, I need to be asking them first and foremost about what they need and how I can support them. But just from your experience, perhaps I wanted to ask if there was something that you, and this is a quite a bit younger. We're in the same age, 20, 25, 26. So when you were, perhaps something that you wouldn't be comfortable asking other people to support you in, something that you might be, not feel comfortable asking them. Is there anything like that that I could do for my friends?
Thank you. I would say that probably one of the biggest things that you can do for your friend is just simply accept them. And I share that. So, I mean, I came out at the age of 50. And that process meant I'd known some people for 30 years that I still know today, thankfully. And that process was that they kind of were struggling with the language, and they would kind of go, oh yeah, well, before, whenever you were so-and-so, and I don't use my former name, we call it a dead name, but I don't use it. So and they would go, oh yeah, whenever with that, and I go, no, it's just, you were with me. I remember doing that with you. I may not have looked like Cynthia, I may not have been called Cynthia, but I was me. And so it really is accept who I am now, not who I was. So even when you talk about, oh, well, 30 years ago, Cynthia and I, we went out and we went to a party and it was a lot of fun. And there's usually different stories that follow that sentence. But it was in that kind of phrasing is how they recognize and accept my identity today and not force me to have to go through the microaggressions that are caused by constantly being misgendered by drawn back to a reference of who I was. I was Cynthia back then. I just wasn't called it and looked like that. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Yes, go on, Cynthia.
Oh, I was just going to ask if there was any other questions.
Yeah, it was me again, Cynthia. Sorry, I feel like I'm dominating the whole room today, because I was just thinking, you just spoke about your name. How did you choose your name? Because most of us just stick with our birth names, don't we, really? So,
yeah, I mean, my birth name is a very British birth name, male birth name, and it did not relate to my identity. So the name is intriguing because it simply came from when I was 48 years old. I was at a tech conference in outside of Calgary, Alberta, in beautiful Banff National Park. And I was sitting at the Banff Resort. I was looking out at the mountains and the whole bit. And there's a whole set, but basically I was cross-dressed, which is a transvestite, because I wanted to touch, if there's time, on this idea of trans. People go, oh, well, trans, T-R-A-N-S as a short. It's really bad because it's a confusing short phrase. But it was this whole idea of who is this woman in the mirror looking back at me? And it was the very first time I ever felt I needed to create an identity to it. And for me, that's when it went from cross-dressing, which is a sexual fetish, that it actually became an identity issue and really was kind of front and center. And when I thought about who am I really wanted to be the representative of these girls I grew up with, and they were called Cynthia. And so that was the name. Now, that choice actually is what caused the rift with my father, who I was very, very close with, because his mother was Justina Cynthia, but they called her Cynthia. And so he thought I'd taken her name and that it was somehow a real in her face to him and to her memory. And that's what caused us to separate at the time. And it was really just happenstance that Cynthia is also a family name, but it was not why I chose it in the very first place. It was just representative of the woman that I was. So thank you. Could you explain what's meant by acceptance without understanding? And sorry if I missed. Okay, yeah, so Christine is just asking me to clarify. So the whole idea, just to restate, is the world is very much created, we grow up learning to ask the question why. Why is the question to create understanding? So therefore, as a society, we need to understand someone in order to accept them. And when we're dealing with diverse people, that becomes problematic. And so what I found for myself is I ask, just accept that I'm a human being. Can you accept without understanding that I am just simply a human being? And the intriguing part is that idea has evolved where I say to people now, begin with acceptance without understanding, but grow to acceptance with understanding, because creating a positive space of acceptance opens the door to conversation, because we are human after all. We are curious, we want to learn, and therefore we want to have the dialogue to gain understanding. But that door opening is acceptance that begins that process. So acceptance is accept without understanding, because you can't understand what you don't have an opportunity to learn about. So, oh, okay, good. That's it. But yeah, I wanted to touch on, and if there's other questions, feel free to put a hand up, come off mute, interrupt me, that's okay. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Daya.
Sorry, I just have to say this, that just share, I have a transgender brother. So this is obviously very close to my heart, and it's been amazing to see my family just accept him from when I say family, I mean my parents only. Some other people in the family have had issues and they still sort of are not on board. But what I wanted to just share is for, he had the surgery, top surgery as they call it. And I went to Canada for that. And in the waiting room, we were 5 of us waiting for him outside. And the nurse actually said that this is probably, I've never seen such a big group, because usually people who come here, patients who come here, they have one friend who takes them home and drops them off. So family acceptance is so, so important. Yeah. And I wonder if, and I actually don't know what your work is, but is that something that sort of you talk about or, encourage in different ways?
Absolutely. I mean, it wasn't my experience. I had a friend who flew out with me. They needed to step back. Thank you, Hazel. Yeah, and I ended up going through the surgical and the initial recovery process all alone, because that happened within that first 2 years. I think it makes me a stronger woman by having to face that and go through that alone. And I mean, there's other patients who are going through the same experience, so we were talking about it, but absolutely, family's so, so important. And, it's part of what I love to do is to use all of my coaching skills and everything else and provide the service to, 2S LGBTQIA plus, individuals and their families who are really struggling in that space, and to kind of provide that coaching to really help them find some level of acceptance on the journey forward. And I definitely believe it very strongly. And when I meet parents who are so accepting of their child, because in my case, I said to my father, but I'm still your child. And he couldn't accept me. There's no greater rejection than your parent rejecting you in that moment. And I would not want anyone else to have to go through that. And so I bring that to every engagement that I'm going into. And if I can help create any level of acceptance for anyone in that space, that's why I do what I do.
I want to say a big thank you, Cynthia, on behalf of those of us here on the call, from Liz and I, for really stepping up and sharing those experiences. And there are moments just like now when you shared some things that are very personal to you, and I applaud your bravery and courage for doing that with us. So thank you so much from all of us. And I also want to thank all of you as you go back into your day now. I hope you found the conversation and the sitting with the story, helpful. And I really want to thank you for gifting Cynthia that gift of hearing her story and valuing it. And as she said, with us having a little bit more understanding of that acceptance. So we're moving, Cynthia, towards, I don't think any of us are there in terms of complete acceptance through understanding, but we've put our toes in the water of all of that. And so thank you for helping us to do that. I really appreciate that. So Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us and for yeah, just holding the book open for a while. Have a good afternoon.